This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and I am here today with Dr. Chris Masterjohn, who has a PhD in nutritional science, and he has a startup, a health startup that is called Mitome, and we will be talking about Mitome today. But first, I told Chris I thought it was important maybe to talk about what the mitochondrion is, why it's really important. Those of you who have some biological sciences background, probably will know a lot of this, but for a lot of people who are not trained or have not studied that area, mitochondria is just a word, and I think sometimes people forget or are unaware of how essential it is to the body's function. So, Chris, could you first start us out with what the mitochondrion does, what it is, etc.?
Well, if you only remember from your high school biology what you've been reminded by memes, you probably at least know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And although that's kind of a joke these days, that really does get to the heart of what the mitochondria are doing, because you need to invest energy in everything that you produce in your body, everything that you repair in your body, everything that you maintain in your body, and into the distribution of everything in your body. And so what your mitochondria are doing are they're producing 90% of the cellular energy. So they really are, you could think of just how society would fall apart if 90% of our energy disappeared. Same thing's going to happen in your body. And you could look at that from the health consequences in a few different ways. One is you could just go to PubMed and type in mitochondrial dysfunction and then put in hair loss or aging or neuromuscular dysfunction or whatever you are interested in. And you'll find that there's a whole body of literature on how mitochondrial dysfunction is known to play a causal role in the pathogenesis of that particular thing. You can also think of it from an intuitive level, though. If you need to produce things in your body and you need to maintain them and you need to repair them and you need to put them in the proper places, nothing's really going to work without proper cellular energy production. And if you think about aging as the falling apart of everything in your body over time, that is kind of a testament to the role of mitochondrial energy production itself. Because if you look at mitochondrial function over time, you have kind of a linear decline from at least age 18, possibly earlier than that. That's based on cross-sectional data from 18 to people in their 80s. And one thing I like to point out about that is that although there's a straight line down with aging and mitochondrial dysfunction, the spread across that line is enormous. So if you just look at the variability, aging is only explaining about 25% of your mitochondrial function at any given age. And I like to put a positive spin on that, which is that means that 75% of your mitochondrial function is up to you and what you choose to do with your life in terms of healthy behaviors. And I think that's the crux of it. When you look at what do you get with aging, you're getting kind of anything that you would have a goal about with your health or anything that you would have a fear about in your health. It's, everything's getting more negative with age, and that's due to this linear decline in mitochondrial function. And I think, a lot of people would say, well, what causes that? And I think it causes itself. I think that because mitochondria are responsible for fueling the production, maintenance, repair, and distribution of everything in your body, they're also responsible for fueling the production, repair, maintenance, and distribution of everything in themselves. And so if you have an energy budget in any given day, but some of those days you didn't eat that well, or you overtrained, or you got sick, or whatever happened, some of that energy that should have been put into repairing the mitochondria got sucked into something else. And you just have multiple days where some stressor just docks you 0.01% in your ability to, in the ability of your mitochondria to fuel the repair of themselves. And so that just drives the loss of mitochondrial function over time. So that's how I see that.
Yeah, obviously, there are practical implications for mitochondria, and we will get into that, get into what Mitome does, and why people should be interested in these questions. I mean, I think you've already made a pretty good case at this point. I want to remind people, mitochondria is very are very very there's a lot of them in your body, and there's a huge range. So I think like some tissue has very few because the energetic needs are minimal, and then I think cells in your heart have like hundreds or thousands of mitochondria, right? Because yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but yeah, red
No,
blood
no,
cells
no.
don't have any mitochondria. So you have
Okay, red blood.
0 to hundreds. Yeah.
Yeah, 0 to 100. So we have like a wide range within your body, and so when we're thinking about how mitochondria function, it depends on your life cycle, it depends on your tissue, it depends on your circumstances. So it's not a one size fits all. And I think people who have seen cell biology depictions, it's just interesting to see all these like organelles. So it's like I think the way people need to think about it sometimes is it's easy to think of a human body with different organs, obviously, but from a biological perspective, when you think of the cell has these organelles, so the cell has its own constituents, and so mitochondria is one of the constituents. It's actually like pretty numerous. There are hundreds of mitochondria in any given cell. And from a perspective of evolutionary genetics, I think I just want to remind the listener the reason that a lot of evolutionary biology, or in terms of human phylogenetics, started with mitochondrial DNA, and because mitochondria, the hypothesis, which I think pretty much people agree, it's absorbed. It's a bacteria that was assimilated into another organism, and so it has its own DNA that's passed maternally. And the reason that they originally used mitochondrial DNA to construct phylogenetic trees is before polymerase chain reaction, which allows you to amplify DNA in the 1980s. It was really hard to get enough DNA material. So, you have hundreds of mitochondria with DNA in your cell, but you only have, one, you have two copies of DNA, in your cell at any given time. And so you have so much more DNA because there's so much more mitochondria. And so that was really useful, totally unrelated to the biological function of mitochondria, just in terms of understanding, obviously our species history and whatnot, because it's been, mitochondria have been with us since the root of eukaryotic organisms, right? I think like 500 million years or something like that.
Yeah. I I think that it is important though, for like if you're thinking about mitochondrial DNA from an evolutionary perspective, you are focused on the mitochondrial DNA. I do think it's important from a kind of biological and practical perspective to observe that the marriage between the mitochondria and the rest of the cell has become very interdependent. And there are hundreds of, so there's 297 genes that are involved in the mitochondrial respiratory chain, which are the engines of ATP generation. And I believe 37 of them are mitochondrial and the other are nuclear. So you have a pretty massive assistance from the nuclear genome.
Yeah. So the word holistic is overdone, but when we're talking about this sort of health and well-being space informed by nutritional science and biochemistry and everything like that, when we're focusing on one particular element, obviously that's within a bigger context, right? And so can you tell me how you know you were I think you were a professor at Brooklyn College for a little while, for a couple of years, and I think you got your PhD at Connecticut, but you did your postdoc somewhere else. Was it in Illinois? Do I remember correctly?
Yeah.
And also we have engaged on social media before. Actually, you know what? This is kind of unscheduled, or not in the agenda, but I want to talk about what happened during COVID and that period on social media and really to science. And because I think you got some prominence, aside from your academic work, you got some prominence there. I mean, just so the listeners know, you should
I
go
got
watch,
pretty
yeah,
there.
yeah. So, and you were on Rogan. Just so the listeners know, I think a lot of them probably will already kind of be familiar a little bit, but you should go check out that episode. But yeah, actually talk about the COVID period a little bit, and then we can move back to the company and the science.
Okay. Yeah. So I got my PhD in nutritional sciences from UConn Stores. I did my postdoc at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. For 2.5 years, I was assistant professor of health and nutrition sciences at Brooklyn College in Brooklyn, New York. My journey was kind of influenced by the fact that I did move to New York, not for my career, but for personal reasons. And I did, I just winding up in a CUNY system kind of pushed me over the edge in a negative way, but really kind of hastened what I think was inevitable, which was me leaving academia. The reason that I left, I do love teaching and I do love research, and I do love autonomy. And academia is great for teaching research. And I would say, a professor has one of the most autonomous jobs that an employee can have. But I really, going to Brooklyn College was really heavy on the teaching and really heavy on the bureaucracy, which I think is one of the negatives of academia. And it just became clear that the things that I really wanted to do, which is move the idea space forward, I just had too many roadblocks in the way. And had I pursued a professor position at University of Illinois, I think it would have taken an extra 10 years because I would have, my job would have been balanced in the way that I wanted it to be. But I think I inevitably would have just left academia just because I feel like I can accomplish a lot more when I'm not tied down by bureaucracy. So that's that story. COVID, I guess I'm lucky that I had already exited academia by the time COVID was around because, I got COVID early on. So I had at the very beginning of the pandemic. So I had no interest in getting a COVID vaccine. Wasn't really even thinking of it from a perspective of whether I thought the COVID vaccine was a good idea or not. It just sort of obvious that if I had COVID, I didn't need the COVID vaccine. Why would I get it? So I got kicked out of my gym, but over the vaccine mandates, because I'm not going to get a vaccine because to go to the gym. But anyway, so if I had been,
let me just jump in right here to refresh people because the whole COVID period, the logic here is you get the vaccine and we can have arguments now about the efficacy of this, but it was you don't get COVID and you don't spread it. You already got COVID, so you already have immunity. So there's no logical reason to get the vaccine except there's a mandate and a bureaucracy that you get the vaccine, right? That's the issue here. It makes no logical sense, even if you accept the premise of preventing the spread.
There were papers published in December of 2020 about why the vaccine would not stop the spread. Spread was not analyzed in the randomized trials. So these are post hoc rationalizations for the mandates. They have nothing to do with the science. And the same thing is true of decreased severity. A lot of people post hoc rationalized that the vaccine isn't supposed to stop the spread. We never said that. It's supposed to make you less sick. And that also was a completely post hoc rationalization. It was never part of the rationale of the trials. And the trials didn't show any effect on severity. What the trials showed was that If you thought you had COVID and a doctor agreed with you that you had COVID and you were sick with something that looked like COVID, if you got the PCR test, it would be more likely to be negative. That was the outcome of every single randomized controlled trial that was done on every COVID vaccine. And early on, Peter Doshi had pointed out in the BMJ that the that the FDA briefing document for the December 2020 emergency use authorization of the Pfizer vaccine showed data that was never published in the Pfizer 2-month trial. And that was that 95% of the people who thought they had COVID tested negative. So the trial was ignoring 95% of respiratory illness, which makes you ask, does it make you not get a respiratory illness? Apparently not, because 95% of respiratory illness was dismissed in the trial. But also, there were only 6 people who had severe cases and 4 who wound up in the hospital, and they were evenly distributed between the vaccine and the placebo. So the idea that there was a severity effect is also absurd. But what drives me crazy from a government transparency and science transparency perspective is we only have the data on non-COVID respiratory or non-COVID PCR negative COVID-like illness, 95% of the respiratory illness that occurred in the Pfizer trial. We only have that data for 2 months of the Pfizer trial. We don't have it for any of the other vaccines. We don't have it for the 6-month results of the Pfizer trial. We still don't have it. And somewhere in the FDA documents that they decided they wanted to release over the course of 75 years for the FOIA request, it's in there somewhere. But and I stopped following it because I lost interest in this long ago.
Yeah.
For a while, I was analyzing the FOIA documents as they came out. I'm like, where the hell is the 6-month PCR negative COVID-like illness data? And it just never came out. So, we don't, I mean, this is not why I didn't get the vaccine, but, analyzing it now, looking backwards, everyone believes these post hoc rationalizations were there at the beginning. And the only reason, if you were a historian, you would be, you would just be smashing your head into the wall because literally no one was saying that in December of 2020. They were post hoc rationalizations. But the way that they used social media censorship as a sledgehammer to punish dissent, and the way they did that, on the bigger stage and in the national media and with the bully pulpit of various government agencies, everyone just believes these things about the vaccine. They were never really true. But that has nothing to do with why I didn't get the vaccine. I didn't get the vaccine because everyone has always known that getting sick with an illness is the best way to become immune to it. There was never a question of whether natural immunity was just as good as a vaccine. No one serious ever thought that that wasn't true. The only serious thing you could have ever said in favor of a vaccine is, yeah, it might be just as good or less good at providing immunity, but you're not going to get sick and die. That was the argument for the vaccines. So for people like Fauci and others to have come out and said, well, we don't know if natural immunity is as effective at reducing future illness, they made that up. And they had to ignore every single study that came out because the studies were showing it was 26 times more effective to get sick. And, if you were making a decision to get vaccinated, it wasn't, the rational reason was because you thought, well, if I get sick, I might have superior immunity going forward, but maybe I won't recover, or maybe I'll wind up with some severe long-term consequence. That was the reasonable, rational reason to get the vaccine. But so I got COVID at the very beginning, so I had no reason to get it. But your question was about social media. I mean, I guess I had a mass migration in my following because, I wasn't even motivated to be a vocal opponent of the vaccine, but I would just share a study like that, like 26-fold difference or whatever. I was just reading the science, and then I'd have people who were accusing me of mass graves in Mexico or whatever, and I'm like, what are you talking about? But yeah, I almost got banned from YouTube. I had Instagram accused me of physical violence for posting a study that showed that arginine was effective against COVID. They censored it, and they told me that I was physically harming people by making them think there was something else besides the vaccine they could do. And I'm like,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. I mean, we'll move on from this. I will say, the amount of policing of social media, of the internet, is actually like pretty incredible what we just accepted. Because I remember I actually had a one of my earliest podcasts that I posted here uh, was actually with a microbiologist with pretty conventional opinions actually about COVID. Like nothing, it was more of like a review. It was like 2021 whatever. And I posted it on YouTube, and it got flagged as dangerous or something. And it was just because whoever was, this is probably before AI would be evaluating it now, but it was probably a person. They saw that it was about COVID. They didn't listen to anything, and they were like, "Oh, this is bad," and then they flagged it. And so that sort of stuff was happening, even if you didn't say, even if you didn't say anything inappropriate, quote unquote. There was just all sorts of censorship, media industrial complex going on, and so that happens. You kind of get this social media. You're kind of at the center of things. Let's put it that way. I think that's a good way to put it. And now, you're founder at this company, and you have something. It's a little bit heterodox. I mean, I don't know how heterodox I want to say it, because in terms of like this sort of health biomedical space, there's a lot of running room. I think in terms of a lot of things we don't know, we might know. And obviously, with Americans living longer but being quite unhealthy in a lot of ways, there is a lot of potential improvement on the margin. Let's put it that way. And so, I think, obviously, as a friend, I'm excited for you. I'm excited for possibilities of your company. I know, talking to you, and people listen to you on Rogan and other podcasts, like you're very passionate about it. So talk about, the science, and then in terms of like, what Mitome does to leverage that science to increase, well-being and health.
Yeah, well, I think about 5 rules that people should follow for their health. And the first is, for all the reasons that we talked about at the beginning, when you're thinking about your health, you should think about your mitochondria first. And the reason is that, when you're thinking about your health, you might be thinking about your hair or your skin or your body composition, your ability to gain muscle, preventing heart disease, preventing cancer, etc. But whether your body is being fueled by cellular energy is basically it's like the controlling the dial of whether things are moving in a positive or negative direction. And so you could have all kinds of reasons that are not in your mitochondria for having a problem with any of those things. But when you're maximizing your cellular energy production, you're less likely to have problems. You're more likely to have good results. And the more you can dial that up, the more you're going to drive your health in the appropriate direction. So you could have, for example, all kinds of genetic reasons for specific traits why when you're less healthy, it manifests in one way, but when I'm less healthy, it manifests in a different way. And I'm not saying don't pay attention to that, but I'm saying think first about whether you are fueling your ability to stay in a healthy direction so those things don't manifest at all, or so their manifestation is much more favorable to your health. So that's number 1.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So number 2 would be, and here's where, maybe some of the listeners would want to push back, or you might want to push back. Number 2 and 3. So number 2 would be always use a food first, pharma last approach. And that doesn't mean don't ever use pharmaceuticals, but it means when you have a food-based solution to your problem, you should be using that first before you reach for pharmaceuticals. And in the middle of those would be supplements. So, I think supplements are great, but you should not be using, they're called supplements because they're not a replacement for a good diet. They are a supplement to a good diet. So always be trying to meet your goals with food before you reach for these other things. Another would be the number 3 would be nature first, tech last. So an example of that would be before you use red light therapy, you should be getting enough morning sunshine. And there's an enormous amount of red light, which is very beneficial for the mitochondria. It's an enormous amount of red light and very little UV, which is harmful in an overdose. You go out in the morning, you're getting plenty of red light. You're not getting a lot of UV. You can tolerate an hour or two of the sun out there. And there are many benefits of that. And that's not saying a red light device is not beneficial. It's just reach for the natural thing and make sure you're living in accordance with nature in a way that promotes your health before you start relying on technological devices, and use the technology to fill in the gaps or to advance your health to the next step. And then the last 2 are my nutritional needs are not yours and yours are not mine. So we all have different nutritional needs. And then my nutritional needs right now are not what they were 10 years ago, and they're not what they will be in 10 years. And that is, your nutritional needs and your needs for everything that you do in your diet and lifestyle are dynamic and they change over time. And where Mitome comes in is Mitome addresses all these rules by saying, all right, we want to think about your mitochondria first. So let's test it and see what its limiting bottlenecks are. And then we can see what are, for you, there's rules there's guidelines we could say for everyone to be healthy. Everyone should be getting enough exercise. Everyone should be eating a good diet. But what are the things that we can say that are highly unique about you, that are different from me, and vice versa? And then how can we use our understanding of those differences to construct a protocol that is fulfilling those last 4 rules, which is, what are the foods that are most useful to you? What are the supplements that would be most useful to you? What are the supplements to good practices in exercise, lifestyle, etc., in terms of technological devices or other types of biohacking modalities? How could we construct a protocol that would cover the unique aspects for you? And then, of course, those will change over time. So you might want to run the test a second time or a third time in the future as your needs evolve.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot there. In terms of, some of these things you're saying, like, so for example, like food as opposed to pharma, I think most people will, I think, agree, like, on a first pass, like, obviously, I mean, don't take drugs if you don't need to take drugs is, I think, like what I think most people would agree with. On the other hand, I do. I mean, it's not like necessarily a pushback, but I will say that there are certain things. So, for example, I mean, Steve Jobs with his cancer, it's a pretty famous case. He tried like naturopathic and holistic, I think, treatments, and delayed his more traditional cancer treatments, and that did cause issues. So I think the framework that you're outlining here, I think, when well executed, is obviously optimal. I think the main issue that I think some of us would say is some people take it a little too far. So, for example, I mean, I don't know. I mean, like, a lot of people, actually, we know this from like the social science and the medical literature. There are people who are hypochondriacs. There are people who basically overuse the medical system. That's actually a serious problem in terms of time and money. That is what it is. It's the Pareto principle, right? But there are also people out there who there have been cases where they didn't make recourse to pharmaceutical or drugs when they had some serious illness. Like, I'm thinking like stuff like cancer. Where I think, there are some things that are pathologies, whereas like if you have a cold, obviously it's a huge problem. Less in the United States, but even in the United States, but in a lot of third world countries, people just go get antibiotics, which, first of all, doesn't do anything. Just to be clear for the listeners out there, most colds are viral. So antibiotics do nothing, and you're just creating resistant bacteria in your body, right? And so, I think we have like this range of choices and decisions that people make, and I think, your role partly actually as an educator still, and just, people who are in positions of power and influence, like Anthony Fauci, and whether he did it properly or not properly is a different issue. But that's why we have people like the Surgeon General, is to advise people and give them the best information to make the appropriate decisions. And again, I think the vast majority of people will totally agree that, like, making recourse to pharmaceutical interventions should be later down the pipeline, right? For example, like, a lot of our problems in the United States when it comes to pathology, like, have to do with things like, obesity, a lack of activity, things that can be quote unquote fixed in very straightforward ways. It's just we choose not to do it. We make the choice not to. And there's other psychological reasons for that, right? And it's like how to nudge people and how to get them to do certain things. And, I mean, like, for example, people in New York City are thinner than people in, I don't know, like, rural Iowa. And part of it is a selection effect. But part of it is also the way
people are in Colorado.
Yes. And, and I don't want to talk about the height stuff because there's some elevation. You know what I'm saying? There's a whole thing about elevation that I think is actually, like, super interesting, and I think that needs to be explored more. But yeah, the thinnest people are in Colorado, and some of this is selection effect, but some of it is also just like the lifestyle people lead in your urban environment and stuff like that. And
I think it's the physical activity, but
yeah,
but I don't. So yeah, I'm doing some altitude experimentation on myself. And it definitely causes a massive increase in caloric burn without physical activity, at least the early adaptation phase. But have you ever seen
an obese Tibetan? No, just I'm trying to think.
Well, there's also a study where they took people who were reasonably healthy controls and recovering drug addicts, and they brought them to Tibet, and they made them hike every day for a month. And it wasn't really clear what altitude they were the base camp was at, but I think it was fairly elevated, I'm assuming, just based on how they described it. But their body composition, testosterone, went up through the whole study, and the recovering drug addicts had way more gains than the regular people. So apparently going to Tibet is pretty good for your health.
Well, so okay, like these are so these are weird things to talk about in a way, because there is like ancient wisdom. For example, like, to be healthy, going to mountain retreats was a thing. Partly it was just to escape malaria, but whatever. Like, this is true in a lot of cultures where there's, like, these mountain retreats you go to, and this is the abode of the gods, and they live forever and all this stuff. It's interesting to think that possibly this might actually be true, even if it's not for the reasons people thought,
Well, this is a perfect example of my nature first, tech last approach, which is, another example would be before you start experimenting with intermittent hypobaric hypoxia training, go to the mountains for 5 days. And my hypothesis is that the optimal amount of altitude exposure for a healthy, athletic young person is 5 days per month of 6,500 feet, and the rest of the time at sea level. And I base this on studies in athletes, boxers, and cyclists, where they found a 41% increase in testosterone production using an altitude tent for 12 hours a night, 3 days a week. And they showed that when they did it every day, you got a little boost, and then it just leveled off and it kind of tanked. But when they distributed it so that it was 36 hours a week, but only once a day, testosterone went up 41% and just stayed up there until they stopped doing the protocol and went back down. And my hypothesis, and I'm going to be testing this on myself to start with, is that you can consolidate those 36 hours a week into 4 or 5 days a month. And I'm hoping this is true, because I would much rather myself and tell other people, I would much rather prove that the healthiest thing you can do is go to the mountains for 5 days a week. 5 days a month, than use, these. I wouldn't, I mean, just on the basis of testosterone alone, I wouldn't even do that, what they did in the study, because you have to set up this tent and stay in the tent for 12 hours. And so you start it in the evening and you read a book and then you go to sleep, then you sleep in the tent. It's like a ridiculous, if you're an athlete trying to get whatever edge you can, you do whatever you got to do. But like most people aren't going to do that. And I'm not going to do that. But if I told people they could go hiking for 5 days a month in the summer, and they could go skiing for 5 days a month in the winter months, I think people would like it. And I think if we could really prove that it was like really powerfully healthy, you could make a movement within corporate America to start having group ski trips and stuff like that.
I mean, look, also like, in terms of like a corporate retreat or something like that, if there's a 1 week retreat, you take it in the mountains. I mean, you could do it. You could do it many different ways. But before I want to move on to Mitome, but like I just want to say, like, I was bringing up elevation partly because there's all this like talk about obesity and the elevation, and there's like the mold thesis. There's all these things going on related to elevation right now. Something is coming out about cancer and high altitudes in terms of like the rate of cancer being lower, and might have something to do with like lower oxygen levels. So, just putting that out there. There's a lot of.
Well, I mean, so let's tie this back to what you originally said about Steve Jobs, though. So first of all, I know the story of Steve Jobs, but I don't know, and no one else knows the details of his case besides his doctors. So, I can't say that much about what he did because I don't have access to the type of metabolomic data I would want to have on someone if I was to share my opinion about what they should be doing for cancer. But I certainly wasn't saying that all naturalistic therapies are better than all pharmacological ones. That's an insane position to take. And of course, I'm certainly not saying that everything natural is better than everything synthetic. That's also absurd. Because if I had a choice between, a toxin isolated from a mushroom versus a synthetic anti-inflammatory, if I'm forced to take one or the other, I'm going to go with the synthetic one, not the natural one. But what I'm saying is rather that when there are good natural solutions, you take them first because the risk-reward ratio is different. And it's not possible for a good pharmaceutical therapy to rival the risk-reward ratio of a good natural therapy using food or lifestyle. And the reason is that the tools that you have at your disposal when you're making a pharmaceutical are limited by the fact that you're primarily thinking about molecular biology and mostly biochemistry. You're primarily thinking about, like, how do I get one thing to bind to a receptor? And then you have a big distribution problem because your ability to control the distribution is very, very limited. You can do oral, you can do subcutaneous, you can do intramuscular, you can inject it into the cerebral spinal fluid, but you don't have the ability to say, and this, great example of this is SSRIs, which goes to another point. SSRIs are overprescribed. And I'm not saying there's no use of an SSRI.
Really quickly, I think most of the listeners will know what SSRIs are, but just like quickly, just tell them what they are.
Antidepressants. Yeah. So the most popular antidepressants are SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. General practitioners who have no expertise in psychiatry are handing these out like candy, and there are hundreds of randomized controlled trials each on. Not hundreds on the totality of this, but hundreds on exercise alone, hundreds on supplements and nutrition alone, hundreds on psychotherapy alone. So the idea that this should be a first resort rather than a last resort, or at least a fourth resort, I think is a crazy violation of the principle that I was talking about. But why did I bring up SSRIs? I just did a blank.
We were talking about pharmaceuticals.
Yes. Okay. So in SSRI development, the reason that the SSRIs cause a lot of nausea and vomiting in the first couple of weeks, and they don't take effect until after that, is because you have these adjustments between one neuron and another, and what you would really want to do is activate one neuron, but not cause negative feedback on the other one. And you want to do all these things, but you can't go into the brain with the drug and tell one neuron to take it up and tell the other neuron to ignore it. And so you wind up with these trade-offs and side effects as a result of that. But on the other hand, if you take something like going to and actually this is a great tie into the altitude, because there are no randomized controlled trials in people of this, but there are several animal experiments and the results are insane. So when they compare intermittent hypobaric hypoxia treatment, which is mostly used for like military pilots to train them to handle really high altitudes for long periods of time. But when they do it on the animals, so it's basically, it's sort of like a technological way to make the animal as if it's in the high mountains of Tibet for 4 hours a day. Okay, that has an antidepressant effect that lasts like 25 times longer than pharmaceutical antidepressants. And why would that be? Now, again, this has not been tested in people, but let's just assume that this is a general thing. Why would it be so superior, and why would it last so long? And it's because if you take something like going to the mountains for 5 days, you are not yourself saying, I want this molecule of carbon dioxide to go into this neuron and not that one. I want it to go to, you're not doing that. You are allowing the body to respond the way it has evolved to respond to altitude, with a symphony of thousands of things that are going on. And you don't even know what they are. Like I could tell you there's a body of literature on a few hundred of them, but there's no expert on hypoxia or altitude who understands everything that's going on, right? So the body's doing all kinds of stuff that you don't understand to adapt to that. And that does include telling things, go to that neuron and not the other one, because your body has millions of years of evolution of how do you organize a whole symphony of responses to that. And so I think that just gets to the heart of the complexity of what you can get. And it's not like you can talk about, I do believe there's a traditional cultural wisdom, but there's also like, you can be as much as you want to be blind watchmaker theory of evolution, you still have to acknowledge that the epiphenomenon of the selfish gene in the blind watchmaker is something that looks a lot like wisdom. And so you have this, like, and maybe it's just purely selection, but you've got so much selection that you selected something that has this incredibly complex internal wisdom that we barely understand. And that's the reason for going food first and nature first, is because you can leverage these incredibly effective strategies without that are just, there's so much, the risk reward is just so much better. But we still have to do the science and the testing on what they are, because, maybe fruitarian is one of them, but we're way behind where we should be on what are the effective strategies, dietary and lifestyle and supplements, et cetera, strategies for cancer. There's a reason we're so behind on it, which is that there's a very powerful profit motive in the pharmaceutical industry that makes them not want to study diet and intravenous vitamin C and other, naturopathic things anywhere near the degree. And so that's a problem. And so it's a problem that Steve Jobs was going on, kind of like an ideology rather than a science, but it's a problem. We didn't have the science on what does a fruitarian diet or fasting or a keto diet or altitude do to cancer. And we need to invest a lot more in that science.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, we aren't where I thought we would be, say, 20 years ago, and showing my age that I've been thinking about this. But in terms of like data collection and analysis, we have so much information. Like marketers have so much information on us, our purchasing and our buying habits and what we're doing. You know what I'm saying? And it's just like, we haven't figured out a way, partly through like privacy, partly through like lack of will, I don't know, of actually leveraging all this information that we have to, do these analyses that you're talking about, instead of, look, randomized control and like these scientific studies are great, but as you know, you're not going to get sample sizes in the tens of millions. But we both know that companies like Meta have all of this information on us. Now, part of the issue with Meta was 15 years ago, they tried to publish on some of it, and basically academics freaked out. And I think, honestly, it was turf guarding. They were like, oh, you didn't go through the standard protocols. So Meta, Facebook, that used to be what it's called, Facebook, they don't publish they don't publish their stuff really, but they know a lot of things about American behavior and life outcomes and stuff. Like, I mean, to give the listener an idea, it's kind of unrelated, but it shows you how deep it is. Like, they have apparently internally, this was back when people used to use Facebook. Probably they're tracking Instagram now. They have like stuff internally about figuring out when people are going to break up, because they were finding that when people had like a breakup, they withdrew from social media. And so they wanted to anticipate that because they wanted them to stay on social media. But this is how detailed, because they know how you're clicking on other people and the person you're supposedly in a relationship with. They know all of that, And so in terms of where we are, we have like location turned on. Most of us, people, these people know where we are. We're posting things on Instagram. They know what we're eating. They definitely know what we're eating if you're purchasing it at a restaurant. This sort of stuff is tracked. And so we have all this information, and we're not using the information. And that's a different conversation, but I do want to acknowledge, yes, like there's a lot of, I think what we were getting to during the COVID conversation, actually, and this is maybe like a through line, is there's a lot of excessive certainty in some areas of mainstream and establishment science. And they project this certainty because they're the authority. And that's kind of how medicine, the medical establishment, actually emerged over the last couple of centuries as it came out of bloodletting quackery, basically. They had to establish their bona fides and that they were serious scientists and they weren't just like, butchers. Well, we are at a stage now, though, I think, where we can have like more a nuanced and more subtle exploration of issues than, simple binaries, which is kind of what is presented by the medical professional a lot of the time. And we don't know how to proceed forward. The medical profession, the establishment doesn't know how to proceed forward. And then you have the whole private sector, which you're in now, where there's a huge range of players in terms of scientific validity, scientific grounding. There are people, as you know, who are pretty much fly by night. They're con men or con persons or whatever you want to say in this space. And so, I know that you have to. That's why I wanted to say your credentials and everything like that. You come out of like a traditional background. You're not just some random person. Not that random people can't discover
We call them con penis possessors now.
Okay, I don't know what to say because it's like con men, you know what I'm saying? But so talk about like Mitome and what your product offering currently is. And I know that obviously as the science improves and gets deeper, like I'm assuming that this is going to be evolving, but it's a new product. It's been around for give us the core history of your product and how long it's been around. And I know you're kind of in the early stages of a launch. You're doing the podcast and other things like that. You guys are you give talks and stuff like that. So talk about like the process right now, where you are, where you want to go, and what your vision for the product is.
Yeah, well, I think that first of all, bloodletting is underutilized now. It was definitely overutilized in the past, but losing blood, about 10% of people, about 10% of men should be bloodletting because they'll get rid of excessive iron, and some people need to get rid of excessive blood cells as well. But anyway, I think that, and I do want to before I get to Mitome, I do want to say, I think that the medical system and the insurance system are hugely in the way on the data collection front. And I think what we really need to do is less medicine and more biochemical optimization. And the reason that I say that is because there's so much you can learn about your biochemistry that does not fall into the category of disease diagnosis. And this is really what Mitome is doing. Mitome is not a test that is used for medical diagnosis, but it's looking at how are your mitochondria functioning? What are their limiting bottlenecks? I'm not making a health claim, not making a disease claim, but we're teaching people how they can optimize the cellular energy production. That's a form of biochemical optimization. And that allows a lot more freedom for and we're huge privacy advocates and we don't take people's data. But when we want to, transparently do studies, we'll be able to work with a lot more data than we would be if we were bound into the medical system. But also the motivation of the insurance companies is to not pay for tests. And they've created what seems to me that, a lot of things doctors believe, I think are memes created by the insurance industry. And so doctors believe in minimalist testing because they say that it'll increase patient anxiety if they do too much testing. And
That's BS. That's total BS, right? Like all the
right.
social
Like, it
science
doesn't
I've
make
seen,
any
it's
sense. But why do
total
the
lie.
doctors believe it? Why do they believe it? I think because it's a meme created by the insurance industry who said, well, we don't want to pay for it. And so, but the fact that the doctors believe it has this reinforcing thing of, oh, we don't want to collect too much data. And I think that's insane because what you have these gross oversimplifications of like, oh, your cholesterol is high, we'll put you on a statin. Well, did you find out why it was high? Well, we don't need to know why it was high because we just put people on a statin. But if you knew why it was high, there might be 15 other things you might have done that had a better risk reward ratio. And by the way, statins are anti-GLP-1 drugs. So you've got these. Anyway, that's another topic. But so anyway, so Mitome is stepping in here and is saying, the test that we use was actually, we extracted it out of what had been the rare disease space. And so the type of testing that we do to say what is good and bad about your mitochondrial function, what would you do about it? We are the first direct-to-consumer way to purchase this testing. And the reason is that we made the choice to extract this test out of the rare disease space and move it into a non-medical, we're telling you something about yourself space. And why did we do that? Well, a lot of people, especially, most people don't think about this at all, but doctors, I've talked to doctors who were like, yeah, I don't understand why we spent so much time talking in medical school about these rare diseases. We're never going to see them. I have the opposite idea. My idea is that we know with the advance of genome sequencing that the 1 million exome study came out, the results came out 2 years ago about, and it showed that...
Chris, tell people what an exome is.
The exome is the portion of your gene. So your genome is all your heritable, basically the totality of your heritable information, at least as conventionally understood. Within that, there are coding regions, and the exomes are the coding regions. And some people think that whether it's cost or whether it's the idea that we want to focus on the things that code for things because that's where things go wrong, that's kind of wrong, because anything, you can have spaces that don't code for anything in the genome, but they play a regulatory role or they play a structural role that feeds forward into an actual health effect. So whole genome sequencing is more advanced than whole exome sequencing because it's more of the total. But whole exome sequencing is way more information than what you would get from a SNP chip test, which is like 23andMe or Ancestry, because SNP chips are basically, instead of testing the whole sequence, they are kind of in a hypothesis-driven way saying, we're interested in these large number of polymorphisms. We're going to test them one at a time. And it's based on the statistical distribution of the sample. And so when you start looking at rare disease genes, they have incredibly low accuracy. They're sort of anti-accurate, unless they do a whole hell of a lot of quality control because they're very interested in one certain specific rare disease. But with whole exome sequencing or whole genome sequencing, you have a much broader data set that is not based on the statistical commonality of the mutation you're looking for. And so therefore you can have a much better accuracy on rare disease genes. Now, it's not 100% accuracy because the methodology is sort of like not actually breaking apart each unit and sequencing it, but it's sort of like it uses next generation genome sequencing, which is kind of like testing a bunch of fragments and then putting them together in the best fit way. And so you get something like if they read it 30 times, they get 99.9% accuracy. But if you were actually trying to diagnose a rare disease, you might use that as okay, now let's confirm that by the more rigorous, expensive, traditional method that has 100% accuracy instead of 99.9 or whatever. But anyway, so whole exome sequencing is a reasonably good grasp of the totality of the genome that has reasonably good accuracy on the rare disease genes that you can't get with 23andMe or Ancestry. And whole exome is an underestimate because it's not the whole genome, but it's got a lot of it, right? So the Million Exome study, which had almost 1 million people in it, so it's a pretty big sample size. They showed that basically the average person or the average distribution of a gene mutation that has a certain threshold that they set for confidence in clinical databases as being pathogenic, the average person is carrying 1.6 of them, which means that in general, everyone's got 1 or 2 of them. That's an estimate. I think it's something more like 6 to 12. There's various reasons. I think the most obvious reason that I already described is it's whole exome, not whole genome. But anyway, let's just go with, 1 or 2, right? What does that mean? Well, there's a quote from House where House says, "Wilson, I need a genetic disease." And he means, he needs to match a genetic disease to the patient. But Wilson says, "Well, I'm sure you're carrying a few." And that kind of illustrates the way that conventional genetics thinks about this. It's like, well, we're talking not about 1 or 2 rare diseases. We're talking about being a carrier for 1 or 2 rare diseases. And a carrier is not impacted by them. It just carries them. But that's blatantly false from a biochemical optimization standpoint. And it's completely true from a diagnosis standpoint. Although even from a diagnosis standpoint, it still has a huge problem, which is that there's this guy, Jerry Voeckle, who came up with the concept of synergistic heterozygosity. And he said, you can have a full-blown rare disease that's not due to a homozygous mutation, nor is it due to a compound heterozygous mutation in a gene, meaning mainstream genetics will say, yeah, you don't have to be homozygous for the exact same mutation, but if you got 2 different pathogenic mutations of the same gene, it's the same thing, right? So that's compound heterozygosity. That's not synergistic heterozygosity. Voeckle's idea, which by the way, has made it into 1 sentence and 1 reference in the main textbook on inborn errors of metabolism, and has just stayed there for 20 years, and has gotten almost no attention whatsoever. But what he showed was you could take something like a glycogen storage disorder, which is a disorder in the ability of the liver or muscle to store carbohydrate in its storage form, and that leads to blood sugar dysregulation and various more severe consequences, seizures, etc. So he showed that you have this glycogen storage pathway that's got 6 enzymes in it or whatever, and you can have a mutation in one enzyme, you can have a mutation in another enzyme, the same pathway, and that person has the full-blown display of the disease trait. So you can biopsy their liver and it's got too much glycogen in it. You can look at their history and they have the same seizures. You can put them on the exact same therapy and it works, but they fail every medical diagnosis because they don't have, genetics, they're not homozygous or compound heterozygous. Enzymatic activity, it's more than 50% of normal, so it's normal. And they miss every diagnostic threshold, but there they still are. And then, so I emailed Voeckle about this, and I was like, doesn't your theory basically say that almost all the undiscovered, all the unknown rare diseases, the orphan diseases and all that, you got rare disease, you don't know what it is. mustn't those all be cases of synergistic heterozygosity just on a probability perspective, just from math of probability, the chances of having the same enzyme be impacted by two different mutations versus, two different enzymes in a pathway that has 12 is like way more probable that people are going to have full-blown diseases from synergistic heterozygosity, but literally no one is looking for it. So
Yeah.
but we're not doing that. What we're saying is, okay, if that's true, then what if I just have a 50% dock in one of these enzymes? What is it doing to my biochemistry? Now, if you, when I took genetics in college, we studied this list of 10 reasons why someone could have a heterozygous recessive mutation and why there would be all these compensations that could bring it to normal phenotype. But most of those don't even operate even in eye color. They don't really operate like that because like eye color is a manifestation of a bunch of different stuff that's happening. But if you go and look at like the melanin content of the eye in someone who is, who's heterozygous for the brown eye gene, it's lower. And if you look at before they had genome sequencing, the standard way that they showed something was genetic in a disease was they analyzed the enzymatic activity of the person who had the disease, and they analyzed it in their parents, and their parents had 50% of the deficit. And that was the evidence. That literally was the definitional evidence of a genetic disease. So the idea that you carry it and you don't have it is, yes, that's true in a sense you're not going to be diagnosed with anything, but that's completely false when you get to the point of, is this impacting your biochemistry?
Yeah.
And so if you're not trying to say I have a disease, but you're trying to say, why am I crashing in the afternoon and I can't get the extra 2 hours of work productivity that I want? Or if you're an athlete and you're like, I'm stuck at the Olympic bronze, but I really want to get silver, or I really want to get gold. Or you're the person who's got like no diagnosis, but you really feel like shit all the time and you have trouble getting out of bed. You're going to want to know if you have a 50% deficit in a gene that's involved in your cellular energy production, especially if it's actionable, because it's a deficit. Like, let's say you have a deficit in the ability to bind a nutritional cofactor. A lot of times, all you got to do is just supplement with the nutritional cofactor and you can normalize the enzymatic activity. There's an insane case report of someone who had a mutation in an enzyme that uses the B vitamin biotin. So a lot of people supplement biotin for their hair, skin, and nails. But if you don't have enough biotin, you die. And this mutation was universally believed to be intrinsically fatal because they thought that it didn't respond to biotin because they tried 10, 20 milligrams. So there's one case report where they took this girl had a death sentence within the first 2 years of life. And they just said, what if we give her grams of biotin a day? And so they just titrated the biotin up until her skin improved, and they kept her alive indefinitely. But anyway, so with Mito, we're saying, okay, we could do this really sophisticated genetic analysis that would cost a lot of manual labor to analyze. But let's, instead of that, just look at what's actually going on in your mitochondria. What are the genetic idiosyncrasies? What are the idiosyncrasies in function? And we can look at that, and we can cross-reference that with what we know about the rare disease space, with what we know from randomized controlled trials of the relevant cofactors, and from what we know from our internal data set. And we can develop protocols to help people maximize their energy production as a form of biochemical optimization, not as a form of diagnosing people with a disease and trying to treat it.
Yeah, I mean, so you dug into a lot of different issues, and I have a genetics background myself, so I kind of want to there's a lot to say there. So one thing that I will say, and kind of stepping back from the conversation in terms of what we're getting at, a lot of science is very reductionistic, and so you're looking at molecular mechanisms. You simplify it, you make many simplifying assumptions because otherwise you can't really do science. But on some level, people acknowledge that it's part of this broader network of cascades and pathways and sequences. So I think like that point is well taken in terms of, don't mess around with something that's already working well because it's complicated. I mean, we are complicated organisms. I mean, I think everyone can acknowledge that. The other thing when it comes to like mutations and, recessive mutations and carrier mutations and all these things, the way people look at it matters a lot. So there could be a trait where, this variant is recessive, but then another trait, because of pleiotropy, where like, a gene has multiple different effects, where it could actually be dominant, And so I think people have to be careful when, they say, oh, this is like recessive and, it's like whatever. It's like, you don't know what other effects there could be. And, we know from like Drosophila studies that even in like recessive traits, usually there is a little bit of an effect, right? There's a little bit of a phenotypic effect. And then like, things that people are looking at are often like quite coarse. So it's like, let's just say that like it's recessive because it only, reduces your lifespan by like 2 or 3 years. Because maybe that's what they're looking at. Like, and they're looking at your fitness or something like that. But it turns out that there's like a serious morbidity effect that's not measured. Like this is something that's, has shown up before in various studies. And so I think people need to understand that we know what we know. And partly that's just like a limitation of like how you can do a certain type of science. And it's embedded in a bigger network of processes and mechanisms. And so today, with all the information that we have, hopefully we can, kind of look at the full canvas. And you're talking about synergistic, heterozygosity or these sorts of things. Understanding how gene networks work, as you know, is a huge operation. And one of the reasons we don't know and not a lot of effort has been put into it is partly because the methods that we had a generation ago, they were not going to. It's like you had to go where the light was. It's like, you look under the lamp because that's where the light was. And, there's a lot in our biomedical science, which I think has been working in that vein. And I think, today it's a very exciting time, I think, for us, people like us who are interested in cutting edge technologies to enable health and well-being in terms of some of these barriers are being removed. But, you have an institutional framework of people that were trained in a certain way. And, they're going to continue doing what they've always been doing until, people make them stop or like there's something that's like a much better alternative, right? I don't want to get into it, but the Alzheimer's, that's the most famous case that I can think of recently to explain to people where there was like, basically it looks like, there's been a cabal within the Alzheimer's research community that's been funding itself. And it's been like citing fraudulent work and all this stuff. And
I wrote about that 20 years ago.
Yeah. So I mean, and some of
I
you
knew
know.
that the amyloid thing was because it was just the therapies that they were making on it weren't working. And there were just a lot of reasons to doubt it. I didn't know how much fraud was involved. I just knew that the whole thing was a red herring 20 years ago.
There was something fishy. A lot of people, I'm not in this space, but a lot of people told me like actually like a decade or two ago that there was something fishy there, that they didn't understand what was going on. Well, what was fishy, as it turns out, is like there was a guy committing a lot of fraud. Because they were like, there are these really good animal model results, and they're like, well, like, why are they not like panning out? Why is it not?
That's not very good for Hanlon's razor, which is never ascribe to malice what you can ascribe to stupidity. I think Hanlon was. No one knows who Hanlon was, but I think he was malicious because if I was malicious, that's what I would want people to believe. But I guess my point is, like, if 20 years ago I was like something fishy about this, then it turns out, it's because the guy was doing massive fraud.
Well,
malice turns up a lot.
Well, so this is. The replication crisis is a big thing in psychology and social psychology and certain fields of psychology. I think it's also, I think it's a huge thing in biomedical science, but I think my hypothesis for why it hasn't blown up in biomedical science is because the consequences are much bigger and like people are going to get potentially in a lot of trouble. Like when you're looking the other way and you're p-hacking on some like social psychological research about like priming, whatever. Like maybe there's some consultancies based on nudging that are impacted. But when it comes to like when it comes to medical health, when people are colluding, like people are dying. People are dying And like, I mean, I haven't seen people do like utilitarian calculation, but like how much money was spent in, for example, the Alzheimer's studies that we're talking about. It was like a huge, it is a health industrial complex, like these whole fields. And the way certain types of science work is that you have these people that are giving each other grants, and, they're all following the same hypothesis. And if you're outside of that box, like, no, there's no funding. If there's no funding, then you don't have a career in science, right? You have to go on your own way somehow.
There was a study that showed that the average age of an NIH PI, principal investigator, so someone who runs the grant and the study, increased by 1 year per year since 1984, which just really makes it look like it's the same people just giving each other grants the whole time ever since 1984.
I mean, I don't want to like crap out. I mean, obviously, like we both love science, and we love like discovery and everything like that. But there's a lot rotten in the state of Denmark right now. And I don't think that. Well, I mean, look, there are people who are committing fraud that probably killed people, right? In terms of like, people did therapies or whatever that were totally useless. Or, probably more likely we gave them like extremely miserable quality of life, whereas like they could have had better quality of life before they expired. And these people, there's no consequences really. No one's going to jail, It's like sometimes if they have tenure, they usually don't even lose tenure. They might lose their position as the head of an institute or something like that, but they still keep their tenured lab. On the other hand, I mean, not to like go on a rant, there's people whose careers have been destroyed because they said some bad word, in 2019. And you know what I mean? It's true, right? There's people who,
I think you're right that we see the tip of the iceberg, and I think you're totally right that like the cases we do see, I think, are the scapegoats for the bigger cases. I think one of the issues is that I think there's like statisticians are kind of the guardians of the science space, but they work on the outside. And one thing that I noticed in grad school is that experimentalists really hate statisticians. And I had two doctoral advisors. One of mine retired and went to NIH, and then I wound up with the other one. They both hated statisticians. One told me, the one who took the NIH job told me, I don't understand why we need to do t-tests on the rat groups, because back when I was getting into this, we just looked at whether it was higher or lower. And the advisor I wound up with, my lab mate so we had to have someone who was not from our department on our doctoral committee. And my lab mate wanted to get someone from stats, and my advisor forbid her because he said that statisticians were, what do you call them? They were, they just, out to get you. And when
I mean, statisticians will say no a lot, right?
Well, no. This is what the statisticians say. So when I took statistics, our teacher would complain about the fact that the statistics department offered free statistical assistance to every other department on campus. And he said, no one ever comes to ask us about their study design. They only come to ask us after they've gotten their results. How do I make this statistically significant? But anyway, I'm kind of, my main point is that in meta-analyses, the assumption behind meta-analyses.
Okay, Chris, tell them what a meta-analysis is. I got to jump in here.
A meta-analysis is when you look at all the big body of literature and you try to pool it together and say something as a whole about it. And that's a meta-analysis does that through statistical methods, and a systematic review does that through qualitative methods. And generally, these things are fused as under the influence of evidence-based medicine. That influence has been, well, we don't want to just say that study found that study found that. We want to take the entire body of literature and look at it together. But in these meta-analyses, what they're always doing is basically working on the assumption that the researchers are full of shit. And how do we develop new statistical methods to figure out what they've been hiding? And so they come out with a funnel plot, for example, which is a statistical mathematical way to estimate if researchers have been doing studies and then throwing them away because they didn't like the results. And now this is used systematically across meta-analyses. They always do these publication bias studies. And they're working on ways to also look at, try to detect p-hacking and cherry picking by using similar strategies to infer what measurements they took in that study that they threw away because they didn't like them. And that influence has also been why it's increasingly common that journals will want you to make your data available for people to look at. Instead of just looking at your mathematical analysis in your paper, you have to provide the spreadsheet of the data so other people can look at it. And all of this is positive because it's, science is based on skepticism. It's not just the personal skepticism of the scientists about their hypothesis. It's that the scientists should be skeptical about all the other scientists. And the disposition should be oriented towards prove it. Yeah. You can, like, a lot of people think proving it means going to the paper in PubMed and showing, seeing what it said. But really proving it is saying to that person who published that paper, prove it, prove those were your results. And I think that the problem is, just in the same way that evidence-based medicine came along and it said, now we're going to do randomized controlled trials instead of tradition. The problem was you had so many traditions that they just kept on doing because no one had done randomized controlled trials on them. And then 30 years into doing the RCTs, they do randomized controlled trials of something like a coronary bypass. And they're like, oh, it doesn't work. Now, the same thing is happening with all the data transparency stuff, because moving forward, the data just gets more and more transparent, but no one has all the spreadsheets from the statin trials. Those are proprietary, right? So there's so much of what's being done right now that is not subject to the transparency of what we're applying forward into the future, which I think is the real crux of your idea of how we're seeing the tip of the iceberg. Because if someone, there's a lot to lose for the credibility of the entire establishment if, something like the Alzheimer's stuff proves to be true about some of the statin trials, for example. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying we have no idea if it's true because we don't have the same level of transparency that we're applying to future trials applied to stuff that was done in the 90s to justify the treatments that are given to people today.
Well, so, going back to Mitome and in terms of your offerings and how you're thinking about the feedback loop, obviously, your product is based on, your scientific discoveries, your understandings, your analyses. But as, hopefully, it becomes more popular as more people purchase it. Do you have a framework where you're thinking of getting feedback from the customers in terms of how they're using it, how it's working, what the efficacy is, these sorts of things, right? Because I feel like...
Yeah, we already have that feedback loop in place, and that's right now that's based on granular customer feedback. And in fact, I would say that the people who are customers now are benefiting greatly from the people who were customers a few months ago, because the protocols are not constantly, but continually being revised on the basis of basically three things. One major one is, how are the protocols working for people and how could we improve them? What were some of the slip-ups that people had, or some of the things that didn't work the way we thought it would, and how can we use that feedback to improve kind of in breadth of because the way the protocols are given is not sort of like, you must take 400 milligrams of this supplement. It's sort of like, this is what's wrong with your mitochondria. These are the things that should work, but you need to try these. And here's how we would recommend trying them. Here are some things that might trip you up, and here's what you should do about them. And so all of that improves massively based on customer feedback. And then the other two things are new research that comes out, and then continuous analysis of the existing research body, because there's so much literature to be mined on how can you there's so little translation of the data and so much data that it's just a never-ending task to be able to translate the existing database into better and better ideas over time.
Yeah. I mean, like, we live in a world of data surplus as opposed to back before. I mean, I'll say even I'm older than you, but like back before our time, you know, there was so little data, and like also in terms of like dissemination of the data, we didn't have internet. Like people, like how are you going to share the data? Like you're going to send printouts. Like I don't know, like these sorts of things. We don't have those barriers right now. We should actually be living in a very different time in some ways than I think we are living. I think part of this is people have confused science and discovery with the institutions and just the older frameworks that developed in the 20th century. I mean, even stuff like peer review developed in the 20th century. Professional scientists to a great extent is a 20th century invention. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be professional scientists. My point is science existed before all of these institutions and all of these frameworks. And I think sometimes many people think that science is the institutions and the frameworks. It's not. Science is actually a process, a method, and it's discovery. And it might play out in considerably different ways in this century than it did in the past century.
I think you're totally right. I mean, peer review, I think, is on the way out, and we're going to move towards a more crowdsourced route post-publication review. I think that's already happening at a lot of journals, and I think it's a very good thing. I'm sure you have some experience here. Anyone who's published, even one paper has an experience with peer review, and mine is that there's maybe a 5% chance that the peer reviewer really makes you think about something differently. And like I have one experience where a peer reviewer made me look at some studies that really changed my mind about what I was writing about. And I feel like I'm a better person for having read their review. But for the most part, peer reviewers don't get paid. They don't really have an incentive to do good work. When you're choosing a reviewer, the way that I learned to pick a peer reviewer was to look for someone who looked like they would be plausibly acceptable to the editor as someone who would know something about that, but who wouldn't know enough to be able to critique your work. So you want to get your paper published. You want a reviewer to give good feedback on it, and you certainly don't want it rejected. And it takes so long to publish a paper that you don't really want it to take our second round of reviews, right? So your incentive is to pick reviewers that trick the editor into thinking it's being reviewed. And then the reviewer, who gets no money for what they're doing, their incentive is to give it back as quickly as possible. And it's just not a super effective system at improving the quality of the science. And I think it's currently giving way to the next iteration, which is, publish it a little quicker, but then ask the whole scientific community, what would you say about this? And deliver that into the actual product that people are able to read and to get the different perspectives. I think that's so much more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I will say is, people complain about, post-publication review, and that only a small number of these, preprints and, publications get a lot of attention. But the reality is that's how it's always been. Like even in peer review, there are some cases, like if you submit to Nature and it's kind of like a tendentious, controversial field or whatever, you're going to get a lot of back and forth, right? But in a lot of publications, you just submit it, and the people that are going to review it are the people in your field who you're on their grant committee for. It's like everyone understands what the game here is, And there are certain journals where it's a line on the CV, it's like reliable, and it's just you let the process work. It's a process, right?
I mean, but that's, the fact that people know each other is the dark side of that, is that peer review is single blind, which I think is insane. So the reviewer knows who the reviewee is, but the reviewee has no idea who the reviewer is. Like you can make suggestions to the editor, but you don't know who reviewed your paper. So a lot of times people people who are not in science would be very surprised at how vicious scientists are on the basis of not personal wrongs, but like there's a lot of people who really take it personally that someone thinks differently than them. I was in a summer project one with this guy who was doing he was injecting green fluorescent protein to label different dental proteins in mice. And one time he was like, he's going on and on about this one other guy who does the same thing. He's like, this man is my arch nemesis. And I said, what did he do? He said, everything he thinks is wrong. So you wind up with that guy reviewing the other guy's paper. It's not going to look good. So I think peer review should stay. I think it should be double blind, not single blind. And I don't think it should be replaced by post-publication review. I think it should be integrated, but they have to find some kind of incentive to make the reviewers do better work, because I don't know if they should pay them or what they should do, but you should get I think it's a tragedy of the commons thing when it's just like, oh, this is your scientific duty and that's what you get out of it.
Well, there is an incentive for some people to review, but that's like, for example, there are many cases. Well, or it's like, you didn't like cite this work from this one lab. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. That's awesome. Yeah. You want to make sure. You want to make sure that there are guys out there. There are people out there where they do the reviewing so that they can get their citation and everything in their subfield of their field, right? And so that's the incentive, which is totally selfish. And so that is what it is. Let's close out. I wanna ask you like where you want to be with your company, with your science, like in 5 years. Like what's the vision? Because I know you startup founder. I know that you guys have a vision, a roadmap. Like tell me a little bit about like nothing. Obviously, I don't want you to expose anything that could give competitors an edge, but in general, like high level, like what's your vision? What do you want to do with this company?
Well, I could say a lot on the product front that I don't really want to say right now, but I'll just say that, I think that there's a lot of data in someone that could be used to improve their health in a way that medicine can't hold a candle to. I'm not saying that medicine, is not important and doesn't do what they do well, but there's a lot more to gain in your health by understanding the nature in which you produce the cellular energy that fuels the maintenance and repair, production, distribution of everything in your body, that is literally controlling the degree to which health and disease manifests. And our goal is to provide people with the highest quality biochemical information about their own bodies as they are functioning right now, and about the actionable strategies that they can use at a level that is unique to them. So I think that a lot's going to happen in science where we need to know what is the ideal dietary therapy for this subtype of pancreatic cancer. And we're not working on that. And we're not quite working on either, what's kind of the basis. What's the basic advice we should give everyone on the ideal amount of this type of exercise and that? But we're taking the portion of, how is Razib different from Chris? And how is Chris different from Razib? And what are all the things that I could know about how my body is unique that I could use to leverage for that layer of, I'm going to estimate it's about 50% of what you should be doing for your health is unique to you. And the other 50% is the bottom layer that's common to everyone. So really pulling apart that 50% that's unique to you, I think is massively game changing. And so, we had kind of said that, I think we had a little, we said both that we had too much data and not enough data. Really, we want more data, but we're way weaker on the translation of that data. And so I think we want to get more data out of ourselves. There's so much to be learned about full metabolomic data on what is happening in my body right now and what happens to it over time. And then there's just if we can get 1,000 times more information about that, we can get 1,000,000 times better actionable strategies. because we're so much more deficient in the translation of the data than we are in getting the data. So really maximizing what we can know by extracting tremendously more data, but then really 1000xing the translation of that data is our mission over the next 5 years to really give people full in-depth knowledge of what they should be doing that's unique to them to maximize their cellular energy production, which is then going to feed forward into mitigating all the concerns and fears they have about their health, as well as supporting all of the goals that they have for their health.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I mean, there's been a lot of people who have been working in this space in various ways for the last 20 years to, various levels of success. Like I can tell you, I mean, that was one of the early business plans, one of the early goals of 23andMe before 2010, and that didn't work out for various reasons. Maybe timing, maybe the genetics, like focusing just on genetics probably was not enough. Whether you succeed or not, ultimately, I think that this like high level vision, it has to be where we have to go in the 21st century. I think, health and wellness for the human race, I think we made a lot of progress in the 19th and 20th centuries with public health, with vaccination, with antibiotics, also like, understanding what saturated fat or like not necessarily saturated, but trans fats, whatever, understanding what's going on at a general level. But as we go into the 21st century, I think, where we have the returns on, knowledge and information is the personalization. I think we've been talking about this probably for the whole 21st century in the biohealth space. And whether it happens in the next 5 years or the next 15 to 20 years, really, I'm skeptical that it's going to take 15 or 20 years. I think we're very, very on the cusp right now, probably with like, AI, generative AI and all these tools to allow us to, understand the data, sift through the data. I think this is definitely where we need to go. And, I think the idea, this from an American perspective, the way I would always pitch it, because I've been in this space myself, is, you want to empower the individual, you want to empower the consumer, you want to empower the person to make the choices that are right for them based on what their needs are, And, the 20th century thinking is like, okay, well, you're a person and we know what people need. And so we're going to give this to you as a person rather than focusing on, how you are as an individual person, and so I think this is like a very, very important area to move forward in. It's going to be a big part of our economy. Personalization is just going to be a big part of how we, enable human flourishing. Is I think, the broadest way that I would say. And health and wellness, obviously, like you don't need to make an argument for it. Everyone wants to be as healthy and fit as possible. And, people say like, oh, they're this hack, that hack. It might be trivializing to say it's a hack. But, to have good information that's actionable for you as an individual, that's really the dream. And I think, that's what you're chasing with Mitome. That's what other companies out there are chasing. But I will say for the listener, not everyone is in it for the right reasons. There's a lot of money here. And so just be careful, be cautious. Like, obviously Chris here, that talking for an hour and a half, you can tell that he's got a passion for this. He has the background, the interest and, the focus. But just be a little cautious because you're going to hear a lot of different things from a lot of different people. And some of it's true and some of it's not, and like, that's up to you as an individual to make the choice. So I guess that's how I would, end this conversation. Do you have anything else to say, Chris? Give a big shout out.
No,
By the way, you have this podcast. I was just like, I Googled right before actually we got on just to double check. You have a podcast that has like 700 entries, right? Right. So you've been doing that for a while, right?
Making content?
Yeah, no, you have this like you have a podcast. It's like it's what is it called? It is Mastering Nutrition.
Yeah.
Right? And so how long have you been posting on Mastering Nutrition? It's like you have 700 entries on it according to Apple.
Probably since 2016.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean that's a resource right there to see the evolution of your thinking probably, huh?
Yeah, for sure.
Like
I'd direct people to my Substack, Chris Masterjohn, phd.substack.com, because that's kind of where everything goes. I do a lot of written content more than I do audiovisual content, but also you can find my podcasts and everything from there. So
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Well, it's been a great conversation. We could go longer. Not as long as I don't go long as Rogan. I think your podcast with Rogan was like what, like 2.5 hours, 2 hours 45 minutes, something crazy like that, right?
It was around, I think it was 2 hours and 20 minutes.
Okay, so it's a pretty concise podcast for as Rogan goes. Because some of those podcasts are pretty long.
Yeah, I looked at them and they're it's on the lower end of normal, but they're mostly between 2 and 3 hours.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, actually, like, so you got. I mean, I checked the numbers at one point. Like, wait, like, you probably got like 1 million viewers in total or listeners somehow through that distribution. Like, have
No,
you gotten a lot of? Yeah.
if you look at Spotify, it was millions. I don't know what the current one
Yeah.
is. It was around, last I looked, it was around 2 million on Spotify, and maybe it hit 5 or 600,000 on YouTube.
What was the most surprising feedback, by the way? Like having that much exposure. What was the most surprising feedback you got?
Um, well, I got some very interesting text messages that I can't disclose. But I guess, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the feedback ranged from people telling me they wanted to take me under their wing because I was going to explode, and people telling me that they didn't understand any of it, and people telling me that they didn't understand the first half, but the second half really hit home. Those are
Okay.
those were the range of feedbacks.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. That's great. That's great. Well, I hope you get more exposure, you and Mitome overall. It's great. Whether you succeed or not, like, it's not for want of having like sincere earnestness here. I think that came through, and I do know you in real life, and you're a very earnest person. You're trying hard to figure out the way the world is, and make it go, and improve the lot of other human beings. And that's all for the good. So it was great having you on the podcast and discussing this in a little bit more of a structured format. I hope my listeners enjoy it. Check out. I'll put the links to your Substack and whatnot. And if you want to check out your products, they can find them there too, right?
Cool. Yeah, absolutely.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite